Thanks, Maureen. So this morning I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our presenter today. Kristi Fazioli is going to tell us everything we need to know or want to know about the bottlenose dolphins here in Galveston Bay. Kristi has worked with the Environmental Institute of Houston since 2012 as a research associate. In addition to assisting on numerous field projects, she is EIH's principal investigator on the Galveston Bay Dolphin Research Program, a long-term dolphin monitoring project conducted in cooperation with the Galveston Bay Foundation. Kristi earned her Bachelor's of Science degree in Marine Biology at Texas A&M Galveston and her Master's in Marine Biology, did I say that right? At Texas A&M University, and her Marine Science at the University of California, Santa Cruz, which you all know is the home of the fighting banana slugs.
That's great.
She has broad experience studying wildlife population biology, behavior, and ecology. Before ending up at the EIH, Kristi did extensive work with the Sarasota Dolphin Research Program at the Mote Marine Laboratory in Florida, as well as leading projects with other government and nonprofit institutions. Before she started living the dream here in Texas, Kristi sampled life across the country. Born in Tampa, Florida. She was reared in Annapolis, Maryland, and then went to her high school years in Hawaii. It's so sad. There's so many beaches and so little time. Kristi enjoys her two kids, the great outdoors, traveling, pets, especially horses, she says. I met Kristi 3 years ago when I started volunteering with her dolphin research group. Everything, which is not much, everything I've learned about dolphins, I've learned through Kristi. And I'm telling you guys are in for a treat today. Kristi, you're on.
All right, thank you so much, Gene. I really appreciate it. I appreciate you all having me here today. And I'm gonna start my screen here and get us going. Okay, thank you again, Gene, for that great introduction. I work with the Environmental Institute of Houston, as Gene said, and back in 2014, we formed a partnership with the Galveston Bay Foundation and started the Galveston Bay Dolphin Research Program. I actually went to Texas A&M Galveston many years ago, and I knew that while we had some great dolphin research in Galveston Bay, kind of down around Texas A&M in that area, we still knew very little about the dolphins in the bay, and that's what spurred me on to getting this started. So we've been running the project ever since then. I am responsible for doing the field work, for getting out there, and then our partners with GBF do a lot of our education and our outreach. We bring in volunteers, and Vanessa Mincer works with Galveston Bay Foundation, and she's my partner in this, my co-PI, and she helps us get funding, and we put out research papers together. So really, it's been a great partnership between EIH and GBF. We each are able to put in quite a bit and keep this thing going. So thanks again, and let's get going. So just a little bit about our goals with starting this program was that we wanted to implement a long-term monitoring program of bottlenose dolphins for Galveston Bay. And this is to collect baseline data so that we can understand their life history, patterns, understand the risks that they're facing in Galveston Bay, and then use that data to inform management decisions, create conservation initiatives as necessary. And of course, public knowledge is the first step to mitigate any sort of risk and to use the species as sort of a sentinel and spread the word about Galveston Bay. So that's why I'm really excited to do things like today and to spread the word so that everybody knows a little bit more about our neighbors out there in Galveston Bay. So first of all, just the basics. Most of you probably already know this, but the dolphins that we have in Galveston Bay are bottlenose dolphins. They're common coastal bottlenose dolphins. They're found pretty much around the world, except in very, very cold waters. But they are found both in deep waters and in bays and estuaries like we have here in Galveston Bay. They are the only species of marine mammal other than the occasional manatee that wanders in, but they're definitely the only species of cetacean that we have here in Galveston Bay. If you see anything else out there, it is probably lost, and you might want to let somebody know. Coastal bottlenose dolphins, you can see a few little facts about them down here in the corner. The ones that we have here in the bay and estuary tend to be a little bit smaller than the ones that you might see out, say, in the Gulf or in the ocean, and they weigh a little bit less. But we know the most about them because they are right here in our backyard. You see that lifespan down there, 40 to 50 years. We actually know that it's quite a bit more than that because we have dolphins in Sarasota, Florida, which is where one of the longest running studies of coastal bottlenose dolphins is. We have a dolphin there. I believe she was 68 years old this year, that they've been studying for quite a long time. And they know a lot about that population. They know that females tend to live a little bit longer than males, so the males will be down around that 50 mark. One thing that I like to point out is that we do not have porpoises here in Galveston Bay. It seems to be very common to hear people refer to them as porpoises. And so I like to point out that a porpoise is actually a different species of cetacean. They have some, very definite morphological differences, and they range in different areas. They tend to be smaller, colder waters. So we do not have porpoises. So I like to make that distinction so people can keep that in mind. I'm going to start just talking a little bit generally about dolphins and Dolphin Society and what we know before I get into what we're doing here in Galveston Bay. This is kind of some of the fun stuff that people like to learn about. This will be based really mostly on what we know about these inshore bottlenose dolphins again. And I'll talk a little bit more later about how we learn these things and what we're learning here in Galveston Bay. But right now, just to let you know a little bit more about the general dolphins in inshore waters and what we know is that they live in populations with very complex social structure. And it can differ a lot depending on where they are in different habitats, what type of prey they're seeking, how deep the water is. And sometimes it just is different geographically because they have what a lot of people will refer to as different cultures. So this means that their society is built around behaviors that are learned and passed down through the generations. So we see different feeding behaviors, for example, in different areas. There's dolphins in North Carolina that strand feed, which means they rush up on the beach and chase the fish up on the beach. And then they teach not only their calves how to do this, but they teach other dolphins in the community how to do it. And so they have cultural things like this in different areas that are really interesting to study. One of the first aspects is what we call site fidelity, and this is just a way of looking at how much time a dolphin spends in a particular region. So if they're a resident dolphin, they may spend their entire life in a particular area, such as Galveston Bay. Or they could be a transient, which means they're just kind of popping in to check the place out. And sometimes you have something in between where maybe seasonally or just once every year or two, they'll wander into somewhere like Galveston Bay. And we appear to have it's a share of both residents and transients in Galveston Bay. So again, in inshore waters, we found that we mostly have fission-fusion societies. So we have groups of dolphins that will sometimes hang out with each other, and then the next day they'll be hanging out with a different group of dolphins. And this is why I refer to them as groups and not pods, which is what other dolphins you may hear referred to as pods. And usually a pod is going to be a large group of dolphins, say an offshore group of dolphins that they live together all the time, and it's a large group that is going to have very high association with each other. But because we have a fission-fusion society, we just call them groups. They get together for short periods of time and then split up and hang out with others for the most part. There is some structure there, however, and what we see a lot of is what we call nursery groups and male alliances. And so what that means is that moms and calves will gather together in big groups and spend a lot of time together fishing, taking care of each other's calves. We'll often have several moms kind of out feeding while you have several calves together with maybe one adult watching over them. Sometimes they like to come play with the boat and we feel like we're babysitting them while their moms are out fishing. But we see these nursery groups often, you'll have females in those groups that are related, but not always. And usually they have calves of around the same age group. So they're kind of like little school groups, if you will. And then male alliances, we have found in a lot of dolphin communities, males, once they reach sexual maturity, will join up together and spend pretty much their whole life together. Usually in pairs, but sometimes you'll have trios or you'll have groups of male alliances. We seem to have a lot of pairs here, which is what they have in Florida, where we learn the most about how this works. And as I said, they'll pair off and this increases their fitness. So they kind of have each other to watch their backs. And they have each other when they go into one of these nursery groups looking for a receptive female to mate with. The two of them will kind of corral her out of that group and sort of hang out with her for a couple days. And having the two of them seems to help that process a little bit. And again, they will spend their whole lives together. So these are very strong, lifelong bonds where you don't have those type of bonds with males and females together. And really just being those male pairs where we see that lifelong type bond. I'll talk about how we identify individual dolphins in a few minutes, but you might wonder how they tell each other apart. And this is where sound comes in. Sound is very important to dolphins and any marine mammal actually living under the water. This is really where how they communicate. It's how they find food. And without sound, they'd pretty much be lost out there. You think about how murky Galveston Bay is. They're really not relying on their sight for very much at all. And it's one of the reasons why things like sound pollution are a real issue right now for marine mammals. So dolphins can actually tell each other apart using what's called a signature whistle. And it's sort of like a name that you and I would use for each other. And so you can hear them repeating their own signature whistle over and over, and you can also hear others calling them by their signature whistle. So I have just a brief little sound clip here that you can hear some of the clicks and whistling noises that dolphins use. They use a series of kind of sound bursts and whistles. So there you go. And so that's a very important part of dolphin society. So dolphins are protected under the Marine Mammal Protection Act of 1972. And it's just important, I think, for everybody to learn a little bit about the regulations in place to protect these animals. Essentially, they are protected from any sort of harassment or killing of marine mammals. So that means that you can't approach them too closely. You can't feed them. You can't try to touch wild dolphins. Any of those things is very important because disturbance can, change their behavior. It can interrupt their feeding and these social activities because they're such a social, complex animal. Again, it can disrupt their communication due to noise and just increase their overall stress if they're in an environment where they're being repeatedly approached or disturbed. In addition, it can teach them to approach humans if they're being fed, leading to collisions, entanglements. The dolphin you see here has been hit by a boat, and these are propeller wounds on the leading edge of its dorsal fin. So we just like to really stress that we want you to be out there enjoying dolphins, but we want you to do it safely. And so that's why the Marine Mammal Protection Act was created. And we have a permit to study them, and these permits are not easy to get. It's for scientific research, and you'll see that permit number all over my presentation and on any photos or anything else that we put out there, just to let people know that we are doing this under permit, under federal permit. Talk a little bit about why do we study dolphins. And you've got this adorable dolphin here, and I can tell you that I don't study them because they're cute, but we will maybe come back to that a little bit. Dolphins are long-lived mammals. They are at the top of the food chain, and they may live their entire lives, like I said, staying in the same bay or estuary and relying on those resources. And conversely, they're being affected by all the factors and stressors in their surrounding environment. And so therefore, they can be bioindicators for that system that they're relying on. So if the dolphins are thriving, then that's going to tell you something, that the system's doing well. And if they're not, then you may have some concerns farther down the food chain. So humans are also affected by a lot of these same factors, which makes dolphins really great sentinel species for the bay. So current efforts in Galveston Bay are really lacking on top-level predators. So that's one of the reasons why we want to learn as much as we can about dolphins. And I know that at Texas A&M, you've got some people studying sharks now. And so that, I think, will bring us a lot of data on that top level of the ecosystem, because we can't really model the whole system unless we understand those top levels. And then finally, dolphins, as I just mentioned in the previous slide, are federally managed under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And so in addition to creating laws about how people are able to interact with dolphins, it also mandates that the federal government is responsible for conserving the species and taking care of them, which I will talk about a little bit more here. And this is kind of a terrible slide, I apologize, but I just want you to take a quick look at how dolphins are managed. So when we talk about National Marine Fisheries Service managing the species, what they're doing is trying to get a really good idea of what the population is doing, if it's increasing or decreasing, and what the risks are to that population. So you can see along the Gulf of Mexico, there are actually 32 bay, sound, and estuarine stocks in the northern Gulf of Mexico. 7 of those are in Texas waters. And right now, these divisions that National Marine Fisheries have created for these stocks are really just divided mostly on assumed geographic boundaries between bay systems, and applying that because of what we know and understand about dolphins in different areas. However, ideally, you want those divisions between population stocks to be based on biologically meaningful data that can really show you where the long-term site fidelity is, and you have communities within a certain region that have a high degree of internal social interactions and genetic differentiation from adjacent communities. That's really how we prefer to make these designations. Unfortunately, these population estimates and how they might be divided are really largely unknown for all of Texas. We know a little bit about a couple of our stocks, but we're really lacking a lot of data still. So that's one of the big reasons why we're doing the study here in Galveston Bay. The main thing to understand about federal management of the species is that they are mandated to maintain these stocks, as you see that quote at the bottom, a significant functioning element of the ecosystem. And what that means to us is that just because there are dolphins elsewhere doesn't mean that if dolphins in Galveston Bay start having a problem, that it's not a big deal, right? You know, some people will say, well, there's tons of dolphins in Texas. If we lose a few in Galveston Bay, that's all right. But the law actually says that those communities, those specific stocks, need to stay as a functioning element of the ecosystem they live in. So that means it doesn't matter if there's dolphins elsewhere, we need to protect each of these stocks individually. So it's very important, and it's something that National Marine Fisheries works very hard towards. However, being that these dolphins are really so local, it's very difficult. You know, they only have so many resources, and they're trying to manage marine mammals all over the United States waters, and there's a lot of species out there that are in a lot more trouble, frankly, than coastal bottlenose dolphins. You know, right whales are on their way to extinction, and there's a lot of marine mammals with a lot of problems, and so they're really stretched very thin. They don't have a lot of money for this. So these local stocks are tough, and so it's really helpful when local organizations, state organizations get involved in helping to manage the dolphins within their own waters. Even if they're not legally bound to manage them the way National Marine Fisheries is, it's really beneficial, I think, to both the species itself and to conserving that general area, such as Galveston Bay, if the interest is taken by local groups. So I'm always excited when the state or local organizations get interested in dolphin studies. All right, so moving a little bit closer to home here to Galveston Bay specifically. We know that Galveston Bay faces a lot of challenges, a lot of risks to the health of the ecosystem here. You know, the Port of Houston is the second largest petrochemical complex in the world. We have tons of residential development from all the way from Dallas down through Houston that drains into our watershed and therefore into Galveston Bay. Ship traffic creates a lot of noise, and as I just mentioned, noise is very important to dolphins, so that can disturb them. You know, the shipping channels, you've got constant dredging, you've got jetties and breakwaters, a lot that's changed the hydrology of the estuary over time. Again, dredging also pulls up the sediment, and it brings up contaminants that may be legacy contaminants from a long time ago caught in that sediment. Galveston used to have a lot of seagrass, and only small patches of it remain, mostly in West Bay. And historically, that probably would have been a feeding habitat for dolphins. So of course, Galveston Bay has made a lot of improvements since the 70s and 80s, but toxic contaminants and harmful bacteria levels are still around and persist in the environment and continue to create problems. So for example, PCBs and dioxins have been found at high levels in Upper Galveston Bay, enough to spur seafood advisories in these areas. And of course, nobody's telling the dolphins not to eat the fish. And these are areas where we see them feeding a lot, and so that's one concern for them there. Commercial fisheries are very active in the bay, and you have a lot of interactions there that have the potential to cause problems as well. And harmful algal blooms, of course, are caused by increasing eutrophication in the watershed. And these are actually tied to suspected dolphin die-offs, which we call unusual mortality events. And we've had several of those in Texas over the years. And it's very difficult to really decide to pinpoint exactly the cause of an unusual mortality event. But most of the time, it's probably a combination of a lot of these different risk factors causing cumulative stress to the animal. which causes immunosuppression, makes them more susceptible to disease and to other problems. So the bottom line, we have a lot of dolphins here in Galveston Bay, but it is a risky environment for them. And so we want to understand those risks as much as we can, so that we can figure out the best way to conserve the species in our bay. All right, so that's my first break here. If we have any questions so far.
Yes, we do. We have several questions. Mohammed, will you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, Kristi, I just want to know if dolphins have any predators, natural predators, in the environment that they live in here in the Galveston Bay.
Yes, that's a great question. So predator-wise, sharks. Sharks are a predator of dolphins, and we do see shark bites on quite a few of our dolphins here in Galveston Bay. So we know that is a factor here. We do get bull sharks and some of the larger shark species here. They're really the only natural predator. Dolphins obviously have a lot of other potential risks. In Sarasota Bay, we see a lot of stingrays. They get stingray barbs, and they are injured, and that can sometimes even kill them if the barb is in the wrong place. So, but sharks really are their only natural predator.
Thank you. And Jean, will you unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Sure, thanks. Kristi, you talk about the law says we shouldn't harass the animals, and just innocently following them in the boat, I guess, could be, based on what you're telling me, considered to be harassment. What's a safe distance, or does the law specify a safe distance that we should maintain between the animals and ourselves or our boats?
It does, and I'll talk about this a little bit more at the end too, but staying 50 yards away from the animals really is the sort of the magic number, if you will, that they've found. And just not pursuing them is kind of what I like to stress. So if you see dolphins, you want to stop and watch them, put your boat in neutral, and enjoy it, but don't follow them or pursue them, because that can sometimes lead to disturbance.
Great, thanks.
Great. The next question I've been asked to read, and it's, do dolphin populations in our area vary by season?
Great. Yes, and I'll get into a little bit more of this later as well, but there are seasonal fluctuations in Galveston Bay, where we believe there's some movement up and down the Texas coast. And so you're going to have an influx of those either transient or seasonal animals at certain times of the year. Around here, it seems to be the summer months where those numbers tend to increase. And we believe that during those winter months, when we may see a few less animals here, there's some increases down south along the Texas coast.
Wonderful. And Cindy, will you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi, Kristi. I'm interested in the male bonding. Is this unique to the bottlenose dolphins, or do other cetaceans or dolphins exhibit this as well?
So we know the most about bottlenose dolphins because they are so easy to study. So we've been able to learn the most. But they do see this. It's actually it's something that a lot of different species use, actually, where males may kind of bond together and increase their fitness by being in a group. So it's not unusual in the animal kingdom overall. And I do believe that they have some evidence in other cetaceans that you may see this. However, a lot of other cetaceans, the way their society is structured is very different than what you might see in these small coastal communities of bottlenose dolphins. So, and we just don't know quite as much about them.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Cindy. Let's see, we have two more questions. Robin, will you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, they've recently closed Rollover Pass on the Bolivar Peninsula, and I've heard that there's been some problems with dolphins beaching and that because of that. Have you heard anything on that?
I have not heard anything tying it to Rollover Pass like that. I do know that we were, curious what might happen when they close that. Unfortunately, we just don't have the historical data on how often dolphins use that pass. No one ever did that research, sadly, before they closed it. I would have loved to, but it wasn't something that we had the funding or ability to do, and it's just not something that anyone has ever studied. I know that springtime is heavy stranding season along the beaches of Bolivar and Galveston anyway. I haven't heard that there have been any unusual strandings, so people may have seen dolphins stranding out there on Bolivar and wondered if it's connected, but that's kind of stranding season anyway. So I am not the stranding network. Obviously, the Texas Marine Mammal Stranding Network would know a lot better about if there's been unusual activity this year, but I haven't heard of it.
Thank you.
Thank you. And our last question. Letitia, will you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi, Kristi and everybody. Although dolphins are mammals and warm-blooded, unlike sea turtles, I'm wondering if dolphins succumb to cold stunning events or have trouble with that when the weather changes. And if they do, how is that corrected or managed medically?
So they're not cold stunned in the same way. Definitely, like you said, they are mammals. They do regulate their temperature. So and they build quite a big blubber layer in the winter months. Dolphins are known to inhabit pretty cold waters. So we don't see that, certainly not that level of effect from cold water. However, cold water can at times it cause some potential health effects, just kind of make them weaker. If they haven't eaten enough, haven't built enough of a blubber layer, it definitely can be a problem. Managing it medically is difficult. We rarely get live stranded dolphins. When we do, then the Texas Marine Mammal Stranding Network again can intervene. And try to help that dolphin, just getting it a proper diet, seeing if they can build up that blubber layer. Usually, however, if cold is going to affect an animal like that, it probably has something else going on. It's probably got another immune system problem or some other factor that needs to be addressed. I do know that one unusual mortality event, I believe down in the Matagorda region, long time ago, it's probably been at least 20 or 30 years now, was attributed to a sudden cold water kind of flood of the area, and a particularly cold winter, I think, and then a lot of rain that brought in pesticides along with the cold water, and they believed it was kind of the combination of the both that caused that unusual mortality event.
That's wonderful, Kristi. Thank you so much. I am really enjoying your presentation. I'm turning it back to you.
Okay. All right. So moving along, I'm going to move on to how we study our local dolphins here, now that I've talked a little bit more in general about dolphins. Our main methodology that we use are visual surveys. We try to get out onto upper Galveston Bay. Right now, our main study area is in the upper portion of the bay because that was the least studied prior to when we started, and we knew very little about it. I knew anecdotally that there were dolphins off of the Kemah area, but we had zero scientific data on dolphins even existing in this part of the bay. So that was the reason why we made the upper portion of the bay our main study area. And we try to get out there a couple times a month and cover that study area to just find out how many dolphins are using it at the time. We go out on the boat, we run transects across the bay, and when we see dolphins, we stop and we take environmental data. We watch the dolphins for their behaviors, group size, how many calves are there, if they're interacting with boats or anything else. And then we take lots and lots and lots of photos. And the reason we do that is because you can identify individual dolphins by their dorsal fins. And so what we can do in population studies of pretty much any wildlife population study, you have what's called a mark recapture method. And that means that when you see an animal, you mark it in some way and you say, I found this individual, and then you let it back out into the wild and then you see it again. And through that process, you can really get an idea of the size of the population and what their distribution is and those types of things. And luckily with dolphins, they get these natural nicks and notches in their fin, which means we can uniquely identify them with our mark just being a photograph of their dorsal fin. And we don't have to handle them or actually physically mark them in any way. And then our recapture, again, is just going out there and getting that photograph. So this takes many, many man hours of going through photos. I just did one day yesterday. I think I took over 1,000 dorsal fin photos. And those all have to be gone through and then matched up to our catalog to see what dolphins we saw that day. This is a great way of studying dolphins, and it's been done for years all over the world. These marks are long-term. They're not going to grow back. And as they change, sometimes if they get small changes in their fin, we're able to track those changes through time and still keep track of the animal. Obviously, if it's a major change, we may lose track of them, but that's all taken into account when we do our data analysis. So as researchers, this leads to a wealth of scientific data that I'll talk about in a minute, but it's also a great way for the community to engage with the stories of their dolphins that are their neighbors in the bay, because we can follow these dolphins, like I said, over time, and then we can share that with you. This dolphin here in the top right corner is part of our Adopt a Dolphin program, which I'll tell you about later through Galveston Bay Foundation. And through its number is 28. All of our dolphins have numbers, but this dolphin was also named by a school group up in Houston, and its name is Dumbledolph, which we think is great. And we've seen this dolphin every year for the past several years. And yesterday and last week, I saw it up here just off of Kima, and she has a brand new baby, which was really exciting because we did not know if this dolphin was a male or a female, and we hadn't seen her with a calf before. So that was really exciting. So Dumbledolph now has a calf. And we can again follow these dolphins through time and share their stories with you. Before I started, a couple people were mentioning dolphins that had been seen in Taylor Lake. And that, again, it was a dolphin I knew really well. Her number's number 43. And she's been going in and out of Taylor Lake with 2 calves, which is really rare because she had 2 calves within a year and a half of each other. And usually moms only have calves once every 3 to 4 years, well, 2 to 4 years really. And it's usually around the time that their current calf leaves them, they have a new calf, and they don't usually care for 2 at the same time. So number 43 is also part of our Adopt a Dolphin program, and her name's Jersey. And she's been hanging out in Taylor Lake with her 2 kids, which is fun. And she also has a calf that she had when we very first started studying her, who also just had a baby. So that's her grandbaby, and they're seen together a lot. So sharing these stories with the community is a really great way to engage people and to learn about their neighbors out there. We currently have over 700 unique individuals in our catalog, and this includes, potentially some transients that we've only seen once, but we also have a couple hundred of them that we've seen 10 times or more, and some that we've seen as many as 40 times in the past several years. So a little bit more about what we can learn when we're out there from these visual surveys. and all the data that we collect. We can learn distribution and habitat utilization in the bay, kind of what's important to the dolphins in Galveston Bay, where do they like to hang out, how many dolphins use Galveston Bay, how many of them are here long-term versus how many are transients. We can learn about their behavioral activities, what they're doing while they're out there, how they're interacting with humans or with human structures, and how they're interacting with the other risks in their environment. We can learn more about their social structure, which is kind of what I've been talking about with the nursery groups and the male alliances. We learn about fecundity, which is how often they're having calves and if those calves are surviving into adulthood. And we can just keep an eye on them visually to look for health indicators to see if they are healthy and thriving here. So this is a great tool. And again, used over the long term, we can really build up a lot of baseline information about the population. The other tool we use is remote biopsy sampling. And for this, we're remotely collecting a very small little tissue sample that collects just a little bit of skin and underlying blubber. We use a crossbow with a modified dart head that just bounces off of the dolphin and takes that very small tissue sample, and then that dart just floats on the water. We retrieve it, and then we subsample that into a whole bunch of different pieces, and we can learn an incredible amount of information about these animals from that one little piece of tissue. And I can tell you that the dolphins are disturbed very momentarily and usually go right back to what they were doing after you get your sample. So from these samples, we can get genetics. So I work with the National Marine Fisheries Service, and they help me with this, where they take a little piece of skin and they can look at the genetics of the population. And this is very important going back to how dolphins are managed, because we can learn a lot more about the proper delineation of communities of dolphins in Texas by comparing their genetics. I now know the sex of over 50 of our animals through doing this. They've been able to tell me males and females. It's very difficult to tell males and females apart for sure in the field. We do go by that if they are seen with a calf repeatedly, they are a presumed female because the males don't take care of the young in dolphins. So if they are seen in high association with a calf repeatedly, we do presume they're a female. But other than that, we have to get a very rare photo that might give us a picture of their genitals along with their fins so that we can ID them. And that doesn't happen very often. So being able to know the sex of our animals for sure is really important for the science that we do. And so this is great information to have. We can also, from the skin, study stable isotopes, which tells us about what type of fish they're eating. We can learn a lot more about their foraging habits in the bay and how those change with the years if we sample through time. And one of our graduate students, Shara McDaniel, is just finishing up her thesis looking at these stable isotopes here at UHCL. We can look at persistent organic pollutants in the blubber. And this is very important. Like I said, we get the PCBs, we get dioxins, and a buildup of those in dolphin blubber can cause a lot of health problems. And it can impair reproduction and cause immunosuppression. And being in Galveston Bay, where we know that some of those pollutants exist, we really want to get an idea of how much is built up in the dolphin blubber. One of the interesting things you see with pollutant buildup in blubber is females tend to put a lot of those pollutants out in their milk to their calves, unfortunately. And what happens a lot of times is females will lose their first calf because they've had this, 7 to 10 year buildup of pollutants and toxins in their blubber and in their system before they have their first calf, and that gets dumped into that first calf, and a lot of times they lose that baby. And then after that, they have a less of a buildup over the few years in between calves, and they tend to be more successful. Males, however, they build up throughout their lives. They build these toxins up. And there is a theory that that's potentially one reason why we see a shorter lifespan in males than females. The other thing that can be built up in dolphins is heavy metals, mercury. So that's something we can look at. We can look at what's called gene expression, which as a biologist, I will tell you is beyond me, but it tells you about, actually what genes get turned on and off when they're exposed to certain toxins. So that's kind of a new and upcoming science, which is something that we give our samples to National Marine Fisheries so they can have a look at that. And lastly, we can also look at hormones, which can tell us a lot about stress, chronic stress in the animal. And it can tell us if a dolphin's pregnant, and then if we can learn that a dolphin is pregnant and then she does or doesn't have a calf, that can tell us a lot about calf survivability and fecundity in the population. So just from one of these little samples cut up into little pieces and distributed to different places, we can learn an incredible amount of information. We have over 50 samples that we've gotten in the past few years, and those are mostly currently undergoing analyses or waiting for us to get the funding so that they can actually be analyzed. And then the last method that we use, and we've just started this, we're really excited about it, is acoustics. So we can deploy essentially an underwater microphone, which is called a hydrophone. And it can just sit there underwater recording sound for weeks or months, however long we program it to stay and the batteries hold. And we also put out there with it a recorder that records water temperature and salinity during that time. And then we can listen to all those hours and hours of sounds of the bay, and we can pull out and find those dolphin whistles and clicks that you listened to earlier. And that'll tell us where in the bay, if a dolphin was close to our hydrophone. And so we can put these in areas where we maybe can't visually survey very often, and it can tell us more about how dolphins are using those areas seasonally and just how often they're going to those places. So this is something that, again, one of our graduate students here at UHCL is just started this project, and she's taking a look at basically how well this method will work in Galveston Bay, and then hopefully in the future we can raise a little bit of funding, buy some more hydrophones, and distribute them throughout the bay, and then we can really learn a lot about what's going on out there, and we don't even have to be on the water, which is great around here, because if you know the bay, it's windy out there, and that really affects our ability to go out and do photo ID on a regular basis. We have to wait for those really calm wind days, and when we get them, it's usually a last minute thing. We run out and try to get that data. But it's great when you can have something just out there, regardless of the weather, recording constantly and giving us some data. All right, so all of these methods work together to help us establish that baseline data that I keep mentioning. Without that, it's really difficult and impossible sometimes for researchers to give you an answer to how dolphins are affected by an environmental disturbance, and to know if the population is healthy in the long run. The question I just got, for example, about rollover pass, I was unable to really answer how closing that pass would affect dolphins because we have no baseline data. And unfortunately, there are a lot of areas in dolphin research, a lot of these little local communities all up and down the Gulf of Mexico, especially, that we don't have any data for, or very little data for. An example here in that photo, that's an oiled dolphin in Barataria Bay, Louisiana, which was highly affected by the BP oil spill. that I know everybody knows about. And unfortunately, they had very little baseline data before that spill, and it took a lot of time and effort to try to answer the question of how much were these dolphins affected by this spill. So by being out there on a regular basis, by conducting a long-term project where we are out there every month for years collecting data on this population, which in a long-lived animal is very important that you get that information over a long term. Then when somebody asks us the question of, well, how did a particular disturbance affect the dolphins, then we have a much better chance of being able to answer that. We can manage our dolphin population, but then on the other hand as well, we can really manage the whole ecosystem. It can give us a heads up about, you know, if there's a problem in Galveston Bay that we need to be looking at. And at the same time, we can really engage the public as well into conservation issues. So what have we learned so far? This is a map of about a little over 800, I think, dolphin sightings that we've had since 2013, when we first started doing some preliminary surveys in the Bay, through July of 2019. And these are inshore of the ICW. I think everybody knows there are tons of dolphins in Bolivar Pass, and you'll see that there are no sightings there in this map, and that's because it's not an area that we're studying a lot right now. That is an area that Texas A&M at Galveston spent some time studying, and we do have some historical data from there. And occasionally, I believe they're still trying to get out there. The Marine Mammal Stranding Network also does some photo ID around that area. So we're hoping that they can keep that up there, and then we can supplement with the entire rest of the Bay, which is going to be our focus. We're trying to get out of just the upper portion of the Bay and really focus on all of the inshore waters. So you can see the green highlighted region here. This is our primary study area. So the fact that there's more concentrated sightings here is just because of the effort. We have a much higher effort in this region. It's not necessarily that there are more dolphins there. But you can see the dolphins spread out around Galveston Bay, and we have sightings, you know, close to shore. We have tons of sightings in the ship channel. You know, they really tend to use that. This is the only real deep water in Galveston Bay, and they really use that quite often. So we have a lot of sightings there, but they also do come up near shore. We see them up around the docks and close to Kemah and all those areas. And then just throughout the Bay in general. I think that's it for this slide. There we go. Okay, now this is a little bit complicated of a graph, but what I wanted you to see here is that in Upper Galveston Bay, in that primary study area that was highlighted, we have this increase in dolphin sightings in the summer months, and then a decrease in the winter months. And that's been consistent throughout the time that we've been studying them here, that we see this dip when the water temperature drops. So you've got your salinity here in green and your water temperature in orange. And so when the water temperatures are high, our dolphin encounter rates here in Upper Galveston Bay are high. And as they drop each winter, the dolphins tend to move out of the Upper Bay area. Now, I can't tell you for sure where they're going, but in the other surveys that we've done in other parts of the Bay, it does appear that those same individuals that we see in Upper Bay in the summer are utilizing waters down in the lower portions of the Bay in the wintertime. So off the Texas City Dike, off the backside of Bolivar, East Bay, Hannah's Reef, we see a lot of dolphins out there that are the same individuals that we're seeing in the Upper Bay in the summer months. So there does seem to be a seasonal shift within the Bay of resident dolphins, depending on the temperature. And then I'll show you also a little bit later, we have some correlations as well with salinity. So when salinity drops really low in Upper Bay, they also tend to be less dolphins up here, and they tend to move out of the area, potentially to areas of higher salinity. So some of the other things we've seen out there during our time is that levels of human-dolphin interactions are high. They spend a lot of time in areas of high human use. That's because Galveston Bay is very industrial and has a lot of recreational use. So, you know, it's important that we all learn to live together. Luckily, bottlenose dolphins are a species that can really do well with living with people. And we just need to pay attention to those interactions and make sure that they are not causing overly amount of risk to the dolphins. We see them bow riding a lot on ships in the ship channel, and you'll see this quite a bit. And you know, we believe that while they may use this for traveling purposes up and down the bay, they mostly just do it because it's fun. It's not very scientific, I guess, to say that, but that's pretty much what scientists have found. We see other interactions with shrimp trawlers. They follow them around constantly. Unfortunately, dolphins like an easy meal sometimes, and they found that they can get that by following shrimp trawlers. They do interact with the lines of the nets, and sometimes we see scars on the dolphins from that. So it's not a great behavior, but it's something that they use quite often in Galveston Bay. And then we've seen other evidence of recreational fishing interactions and boater interactions. And here you have a dolphin entangled in a fishing line and one that had its whole dorsal fin taken off by a propeller. And then lastly, occasionally we see people directly feeding dolphins, which, as I've mentioned before, is really a bad behavior that we would prefer they not engage in. Begging dolphins, just don't engage in proper dolphin feeding habits as much. They learn to get that easy meal, and we really like to avoid them learning that behavior. One of the other things we've seen out here are potential health consequences from big freshwater flooding of the estuary, especially in Upper Galveston Bay. And we see skin lesions on the dolphins. This is hydropic degeneration of the epidermal layer. And then that can be accompanied, here you see in this bottom photo, this dolphin has a severe fungal growth associated with fresh water. So there's a lot of potential there for secondary infections. They can get, you know, this is only what we can see on their skin, but they can get electrolyte imbalances that cause other problems. They can get corneal edema, which is the fresh water affects their eyes. And in the long term, it can cause mortality if they're not able to get out of that freshwater environment. We really don't know what types of long-term effects this might have on their health, and that's something that we're really keeping an eye on. But overall, you know, we have quite a number of dolphins utilizing Galveston Bay. And, you know, they seem to be out there doing the things that dolphins do. They're feeding, they're having babies, and, you know, they seem to be able to make a long-term life here in the bay, so that's good. We still have a lot to learn. You know, we see dolphins out there feeding all the time, but we really don't know what prey is most important to them. That's something we're working on, and how those prey movements affect the movements of the dolphins in the bay. I suspect that that's really what causes that seasonal shift, is actually movements in prey. And then we also would really like to learn what areas of the bay are most important for calving. They tend to have their calves in either like November and then or another peak in March. Here in this region, and those are times when the dolphins are not utilizing Upper Bay. If you remember that seasonal shift, they're probably in Lower Bay, and so we have not had the opportunity to really learn what areas are most important for them while they're calving, and so that's one of our next goals. All right, and we can take another little break here. I believe I'm going over in time.
You're doing good. just amazing, just amazing. We do have 2 questions, I think, so far. Varva, could you unmute yourself, dear, and ask your question?
I actually came up with another question while I was sitting here waiting, but maybe I won't ask that one. I really wondered with some individuals if identification isn't really hard, and whether or not you have anything sort of like facial recognition software that helps you.
That's a great question. It can be really hard, yes. So the fins I showed you all there had great fins. They had really good notches, and those are dolphins we can pretty easily keep track of long term. But there's a lot of dolphins, especially young dolphins, calves and juveniles tend to have very clean fins. And when they don't have a lot of nicks and notches on them, it is very difficult and we can lose track of them. Because our cameras are getting a lot better, you know, we can get good photos of them these days, and we can usually match them up if they have any sort of small nicks or scars and try to keep track of them. But some dolphins are definitely harder than others. There is some software, some new software that's just coming about based on facial recognition type technology that is starting to help us out. And it's something that we're just starting to use, but I look forward to it getting better in the future because that will save so much of our time.
Well, the other question was super quick. It was just how old the females are when they stop having calves.
That's a great question. Of the dolphins that we know, the older females, and in that community in Sarasota that I keep mentioning, they do seem to go into reproductive senescence where they stop having calves, usually in their 40s, I believe. They kind of slow down, and often an older female will keep her calves with her a lot longer. So you'll see a calf, instead of staying, you know, just 2 years or 3 years with her mom, they'll have these kids that stay with mom for like 5 or 6 years, and they just milk it. You know, they stay with mom for a long time, and she doesn't, you know, send them away because she really starts spreading out how often she has calves. And then eventually they do go into reproductive senescence, which is not something you see in a lot of wildlife because, you know, it's fitness wise and natural selection wise, there's not a lot of reason, right, to still be hanging out if you're not having babies. But in a dolphin society, they do. And they're finding that they believe those grandmas really do play a role in helping take care of the young and still being a part of those nursery groups.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Mohammed, you've got the next question. If you unmute yourself, please.
Hey, Kristi, the question is, have you seen any impact from climate change or global warming on the dolphin population or their behavior?
That's something we'd really like to learn, and it's a huge question, and it's something that NOAA as a whole, National Marine Fisheries, is really trying to start to address to find out what the effects of climate change are going to be on marine mammals throughout our waters. So because it's such a big long-term question, it can be tough to answer. But as one example, one of the things with climate change that we see happening is these bigger storms that are creating more heavier rainfall, something like Harvey, right? And that is becoming more common. And actually, if you guys can bear with me for a little extra time today, my next several slides talk about Harvey and the effects that it had on dolphins. And so that's the type of thing that we believe we'll see more of. So increased temperatures of waters could definitely affect where different marine mammal species and what waters dolphins are utilizing. Changes in salinity could have a real effect as well. And then, of course, changes to prey are always going to affect the dolphins. So any changes to the fish populations could really affect the dolphin's ability to thrive.
Thank you.
Okay, we've got one question from Jean. Would you please unmute yourself, Jean?
Yes, ma'am. So, Kristi, you mentioned there's a calving peak, couple of calving peaks per year, but it's really, that's just following a fooling around peak that earlier. What's the gestation period for dolphins? That's what I'm really asking.
It's about a year. Yes.
Okay. Okay.
So dolphins can have babies any time of the year, but they do tend to have these peaks during the season, and those are different in different parts of the country, honestly.
Very good. Thank you.
Mhm.
I think that's the questions for now. So go right ahead. Thank you,
All
Kristi.
right. I will try to get through. I know I tend to be a little long-winded here, and we are tight on our time, but I figure everyone might be a little interested in how dolphins did with Hurricane Harvey. That's a question I get a lot. So I'm going to show you a few slides here. They're a little data heavy. We presented this we published a paper on this recently and presented it at the World Marine Mammal Conference last year. And so I thought I'd share a little bit of that with you today as well. So Hurricane Harvey, I'm sure everyone here probably experienced it, so I don't have to tell you much about it. The biggest effect that I'm talking about today is going to be that flooding of the estuary. So all that fresh water in Houston had to go somewhere, and when it drained out, it drained into Galveston Bay. And so it turned what is usually a brackish body of water into a fresh body of water for several weeks. And this has a huge impact on the ecosystem as a whole. Of course, it affected, the fish and the dolphins themselves. So because we have been gathering this long-term data in Galveston Bay and Upper Galveston Bay, we were able to get out there and ask that question of how would this affect our population. So looking first here on this left-hand side, you see that our dolphin sightings right after Harvey in September of 2017 are in red, and the ones the year before, September of 2016, are in blue. And you can see we had fewer dolphins in the upper portion of the bay, and the ones we did have tended to be a little bit more towards the ship channel, those deeper water habitats. Looking at this chart on the right, again, this is 2017. These are our encounter rates on the bars. That's essentially how many dolphins were in the area. And you can see it drop here in September. Harvey was in those last couple days of August, so it kind of breaks out well. You really see that drop in the numbers of dolphins, and you see that drop in salinity right here as well. And right here now in the green, this is comparing 2016 data. And you can see that during those same months in 2016, there were a lot more dolphins, and the salinity here is higher. You can see these 2 months, September, October, you had higher salinity and you had more dolphins in 2016 as compared to 2017 when we had that low salinity and fewer dolphins in the area. One thing that we found when looking at this data was in June of 2016, we had one of those big flood events that wasn't with a storm, but it was one of those big flood events in Houston, where we also had very low salinity in the bay, and we saw that same low encounter rate of dolphins in 2016 in that month, which is a month where we typically do have a lot of dolphins in the upper portion of the bay. If you bring in temperature here, it makes the graph even more confusing for you. But while all it's telling you here is that in November and December, as we saw that temperature drop, when we normally have a drop in dolphins in this upper area, we saw dolphins in 2017, which tells us that as the salinity was coming back up, which is this yellow line, the dolphins were returning to utilizing the upper bay area at higher levels again, even though they weren't super high because it's winter, so they weren't here as much. So it's a quick rundown of a little bit of the data there. The other thing we looked at with Hurricane Harvey was those skin lesions that I talked about earlier. And so we looked at a couple different factors of skin lesions. We looked at the prevalence, which is the proportion of individuals in the population that exhibited skin lesions, and the extent of those lesions, which is how much of their body that we can see is covered by lesions. So before Harvey, you had about half of the dolphins in the Upper Bay population that had at least a few lesions. And this is, we've had previous freshwater events. And so it's kind of a chronic thing in the population to see at least a low level of a couple of lesions. But you can see half the population in blue didn't have any lesions, and almost the other half had only a very few lesions, a low level. There were a couple that had high levels of lesions, and these are dolphins we've seen that have chronically high lesions, and it's something that we're looking into to find out more about why. During the low salinity event associated with Harvey, which is those kind of 6 weeks after Harvey, what we saw is that almost all the dolphins in the population had at least some level of lesions, and that almost half, of the ones that we saw had high extent and then or medium extent. So they were much more extensive throughout the population than normal, what we would consider normal. As the salinity came back up in Upper Galveston Bay, we saw the really extensive lesions start to go down. Most of the population still had at least low level, but they were starting to go away. So we learned a lot in this study. That's just a very small highlight. You can see on our website, we've got the entire paper if anyone's actually interested in reading a scientific paper. We have a lot more questions that we'd like to learn. We need to know about where are these dolphins going when they left Upper Bay? Where are they seeking refuge? Are there long-term health effects from this type of a freshwater exposure? Potential effects of coastal infrastructure. I think everyone knows they're looking at some storm barriers for Galveston Bay. If those affect the salinity of the bay, or if they affect the ability of the dolphins to find the refuge they need of finding salt water during these storms, how might that affect them? So these are some of the questions we're looking at. In trying to understand the lesions, you can see this dolphin here on the right side. This is one of our moms, number 152. She really didn't have any lesions prior to Harvey. This is her during Harvey. She was covered extensively in lesions, and she was also looking a little skinny. But then by December, her lesions were pretty much gone, and she was looking healthy again. So we're trying to understand why some dolphins have this type of reaction where they show these lesions but then get better. But then we have other dolphins, like I said, that have chronic lesions, and they're extensively covered in lesions almost all the time. So we're trying to find out, what factors are helping them to heal, or what factors are making them get these chronic lesions. We believe that, it could have to do with other immunity issues, age class, range patterns in the bay, and that access to higher salinity. So in Upper Bay, we have a lot of dolphins that we believe are juveniles, and juveniles tend to not range as far as adults. They kind of stay in their little bubble, and if they're less likely to leave the Upper Bay area during a storm, they may be more prone to effects from freshwater. So these are things that we're still working on learning. All right, what can you guys do? Spread the word. That's the big thing. That's why I love talking to people like Master Naturalists. We know you're interested and can get out there and talk to other people. This is a few of our guidelines for interacting with wild dolphins that we'd like to get the word to the community out. I talked a little bit earlier, maintaining at least 50 yards away, put your engine in neutral when possible. A bunch of guidelines, mostly importantly, never touch, swim with, or feed wild dolphins. If you go to our website, which I'll give you that at the end, I have these PDFs that you can download and print that have all of these guidelines on them, both for viewing dolphins and for safely fishing around dolphins. If you know teachers or you are a teacher, we have what's called the pod, which is a bunch of activities for 5th through 12th graders. They're aligned with TEACS. The Houston Zoo helped us put it together. It's a great little resource. You can check it out from the Galveston Bay Foundation, and we even have volunteers, I believe, maybe even Jean, who is willing to take this pod and bring it right to your classroom once we have people back in classrooms again. And so that's a great resource. Something else you can do is to always be on the lookout for stranded dolphins, any injured or sick dolphin or dead dolphin, because we can get a lot of information from a dead dolphin. You need to call the Texas Marine Mammal Stranding Network right away, and they will come down and they will take care of that, and they'll get that data to us as well, so that we know who in our population. I can identify that dolphin, and I can know who that was in our population that's died or been injured. The other thing you can do is you can join our Dolphin Society. You can adopt a dolphin. You go to the Galveston Bay Foundation website for that, and they've got a great program there for adopting dolphins, or even naming a dolphin if you would like to. Other things you can do, you know, right now, obviously things are a little difficult. We can't actually take volunteers. Some of our programs aren't moving along like we would like, but hopefully things will get back to normal soon. You can report dolphin sightings to us through our website. We just started that. So if you see them from a dock or from land, or if you're out on your boat, and you can report to me the location and time and date and how many dolphins you think you saw, that's great information that we can use. Volunteering with GBF, they've got a lot of different programs, and we have a field assistant volunteer program that periodically we will train new volunteers to come out and help us with our research. We're trying to start a group of those volunteers to also help us with booth outreach events and land-based surveys. So those are things potentially coming up that you could help us with. Check out our website. Our website is new, and it's at galvestonbaydolphin.org. You can sign up for our newsletter there that we put out quarterly to update you on what's going on with us and our program overall, and what's going on with the dolphins out there. So you can sign up for that. Like I said, the website is fairly new, so if you have any feedback for us, we'd love to hear about it. It's kind of been my quarantine project to get that going, and get that information out there. So that is it. I do want to mention that we can't do this alone. We have a lot of funders and supporters to make this happen, and we thank all of them, and definitely EIH and Galveston Bay Foundation for supporting this program. I'll open back up for questions.
Yes, Kristi, we do have one question. Jeffrey, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, please. First, it was incredible, and also an incredible photo of that dolphin flipping that flounder up in the air. That was something. Did your researchers take that?
Yes, we did.
Okay.
Yeah, they love the flounder run as much as the fishermen around here, and they toss those things like frisbees all the time.
Wow. And my question is about above water sounds, whether they make them or you observe them while jumping or breaching as opposed to surfacing. And just as a comment for those of us deceived and deluded by the TV, AKA Flipper, which I happened to Google while waiting for this session, it claims that sound was made by a modified kookaburra call. So Flipper was voiced by a bird, basically. Thanks.
Yeah, I don't think they had as much technology back then to get actual dolphin sounds. It's a shame. But we sometimes, more often than actually hearing them out of the water, we hear them when they're under our boat. We can hear them clicking and whistling sometimes if the water is real calm and there's not a lot of noise. So that's always really cool to be able to just hear them that way. And then sometimes at the surface, they'll come up and surface, and we'll hear them make a noise. There's a particular noise that they actually can make through their blowhole. That's kind of like, I don't know, it's just a funny little noise that they make. So we hear that sometimes at the surface too. But definitely having a hydrophone will get you the much more full suite of sounds that they make.
Well, I think that is the last of the questions. I'd like to thank you, Kristi. This was just the most amazing presentation. Thank you so much. You
You're
covered
welcome.
a lot, and there's a lot of excitement, I think, to be involved with the dolphins and a lot going on. Thank you for your work and for
You're
this
welcome.
presentation.
Thank you
Really
all for
amazing.
listening today.